So for this video, I'm going to go through doing selective adjustments of exposure, contrast, color balance, and hue saturation. So to do a selective adjustment from the layers panel, it's the little icon down here that looks like a half black, half white circle. And that brings up a series of options. And the first one I'm going to go through is adjusting exposure. This is actually done by making a curves layer. And so we'll click on curves, and the curves menu will pop up here on how you can adjust the curve. But for doing exposure, you don't actually adjust the curve at all. In fact, we can even X that window out altogether. And instead what you do, to darken something, you would change the layer blending mode here from normal to multiply, or if you want to lighten something, you change it to screen. And for this example, I am going to lighten the eyes a little bit by selecting screen. The image will automatically get very light because the opacity of that blending mode and that adjustment layer is at 100%. And since I'm going to lighten his eyes, what I'm actually going to do is take the layer mask that automatically pops up with an adjustment layer. I'm going to convert that over to a black mask to hide everything by hitting Command I. And then what I'll do is I'll grab my brush and I will make sure that I have the white paint revealed, and I will mask in the eyes. Now of course that's like way too light and it looks really crazy. But what I can do is I can adjust the opacity of that to bring it down to something that looks a little bit more realistic and blends in a little bit more. So this is the before and that is the after on the lightening. So you can use that particular method for lightening or darkening anything you want selectively throughout an image. I'm going to go ahead and call this layer I lighten so that I know that that's what I've done. So again, the key thing to remember when you're doing any lightening or darkening selectively is to make a curves adjustment, but then to not actually change the curve itself, but instead change the layer blending mode from normal to screen or to multiply. Okay, so the next step in the high-level Photoshop workflow would be to do any selective adjustments of contrast. And to make selective adjustments of contrast is, again, the adjustment layer is what we'll click here, and we will select curves. And unlike the last time when we just did the exposure, this time we are actually going to adjust here on the curve itself to affect the contrast of our image. And the main point about working with a curve in Photoshop is that generally we don't actually want to touch the upper right corner because that is our white point, which we've already set in Lightroom. We don't want to adjust the bottom left-hand corner because that's our black point, and we've also already set that in Lightroom previously. And generally, since we're kind of dealing with contrast right now and not actually exposure adjustment, we actually don't want to move our midpoint, which is right there in the center. So to do an overall increase of contrast, you would actually shift the curve like this, which brings the endpoints and the middle back to where it was. And we can see that when we do that, if I look at my before and after there, that is an increase of contrast. And in order to decrease contrast, and what I did there is I just reset this curve with that little rewind button there. Then what I would do is I would bring this down and this up. So basically what that translates to is when you decrease contrast, you are darkening the lights and lightening the darks. And when you're increasing contrast, you're doing the opposite. Now, since we're doing this selectively, because all of our global adjustments in theory are already done, you can actually refine this even more. So one of the examples for an image like this is I might want to decrease the contrast in his face, because oftentimes what happens when you are working with portraits in the lighting studio is that the skin tone can get really contrasty really quickly. So I can use this hand tool here on the curves pop-up window to point out two areas of skin tone, a darker area and a lighter area, to see exactly where those are on the curves and then adjust accordingly. So I could click on a lighter area of skin here and it shows up on the curve, a darker area here, And then what I can actually do is I can modify that curve even more customized to sort of soften and flatten the skin tone. In this particular example, I would again want to inverse the mask here by hitting Command I to make that black. And then with my brush, I could just go in and I could sort of fill in the skin tone in areas where I thought maybe it got a little too contrasty. And I can always modify that adjustment more on the curve now or later if I want to, as I kind of work through the file. Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind, so what I'll do is I'll label this skin flatten. I'll do another one where I'll use the curves layer I'll make another adjustment layer. I'm going to use the hand tool to increase the contrast in the hair. So I'll go on kind of a medium dark area of the hair here and a medium sort of light area there. And I will adjust and increase the contrast there just a little bit and hit Command I again to inverse that mask and then kind of just paint in where I want to see a little bit more contrast. And it's pretty subtle, but one of the things that you'll notice is that when you are doing an increase in contrast, it actually tends to increase your color saturation. And when you decrease contrast, it decreases color saturation. And the way that if you don't want that to happen, you can fix this, and I'm going to go ahead and call this layer hair contrast, is by actually changing the blending mode of that particular curves layer. So you would change the blending mode in a situation where you've increased the contrast and you don't want it to be more saturated. You would change it from normal to luminosity. And then when I flatten something, if I didn't want it to desaturate the colors too much, I can do the same thing and I can change that to luminosity. And the subtle difference there might not be super noticeable, but when you're working on your own image, changing back and forth between normal and luminosity when you're dealing with selective contrast can be really helpful. And sometimes you do want that extra saturation, sometimes you don't, and so working back and forth between normal and luminosity blending modes is important for that particular tool. Okay, for this next example, we're going to do color balance and hue and saturation. And for color balance, there's not really much in the figure that I need to change in terms of color balance, but what I do want to do is I'm going to give the background a slightly different tint to it. So what I'm actually going to do before I create my adjustment layer is I'm going to create the selection first, which is an option that you can do for any of these adjustment layers that we've been working on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select and load the selection of the background that we've created before. And once the selection has been created, now I'm going to go to the color balance adjustment layer, and that will pop up the color balance window option here. Generally with color balance, what I recommend is avoiding using the cyan and red slider. Just use the magenta green and the yellow blue, and that will prevent you from kind of color correcting in circles, because magenta plus yellow equals red, green plus blue equals cyan. So it just kind of helps to simplify, and it actually makes the sliders a bit more similar to working with Lightroom. So if I wanted to kind of shift away from the sort of green background, greenish cyan background that I had before, I could kind of warm that up with the color balance. And what you'll notice is by working with having the selection first over here, then when I created that adjustment layer for color balance, it automatically then masks the way that the selection has directed it to mask. So color balance is fairly straightforward and similar to some of the tools that you've already used. You can also use curves for color balance, but to kind of start off, just use the color balance adjustment tool as a basic option to get started with doing selective color balance. And then the last one that I'll show you quickly is the adjustment layer for saturation. So saturation can be used under hue and saturation. I actually find this particular tool to be kind of helpful if I'm having difficulty color balancing something and I can't quite get it to balance right. Sometimes if I just reduce the saturation a little bit, then that can be really helpful. But for this, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do an increase in saturation, and I'm just going to do something really subtle here because I don't think it needs too much. But I'm going to maybe increase the saturation of the eyes and the earring. So if I bring that up really far, obviously right now my layer mask is on all white, so it's going to just show the whole change. But I can switch that over to a black mask by hitting Command I, and then just filling in the small little areas that I want to see an increase in saturation, which are going to be really subtle on this. And usually when you are working with saturation sliders, it should be fairly on the subtle side of things. So that is the color balance and the hue saturation adjustment layers.